Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, listeners. In this episode, we talk to Jon Walker about similarities and differences between relaxation and mindfulness, as well as how expectations can interfere with our mindfulness practice. He also describes practices that can improve our coping in a practical way in daily life, and reflects on some of the challenges of a driven and productivity-focused life.
Jon Walker is a retired physician and professor of medicine and is now a teacher of mindfulness and self-compassion. He completed the 2-year Mindfulness Meditation Teacher Certification Program with Tara Brach and Jack Kornfield through the Center for Greater Good at University of California, Berkeley. He has also been trained in mind-body medicine for physicians, mindfulness facilitation, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and mindfulness-based chronic pain management.
If you enjoy the show, we'd love for you to follow us on social media on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or Twitter, and come join our free Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/NobleMind. And as always, you can learn about upcoming events, get our show notes, and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. Enjoy the show. Hello. Welcome, Jon Walker, to Noble Mind.
Thank you very much.
We're delighted to have you here today. Maybe we could go ahead and just have you start off by saying hello to our listeners and telling them a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, happy to do that. And thank you guys again for inviting me, although I have to remind you, I'm not worthy. But
he did the Wayne's World bow, everyone.
Okay. Right. So yeah, I'm actually a retired physician. I specialized in ophthalmology, retinal diseases, and I really came to these practices about 9 years ago for the reason I think most of us do, just being incredibly miserable and not really seeing any options for that. The usual resources, spirituality, family, avocation, just left, still with a sense of deep unease. So I tried it, starting with the mindfulness piece, and really the nice thing was when you do it out of desperation, you don't have any expectations. And that's the number one way to do it. And after about 2 to 3 months, things were happening, not what I wanted, but I was noticing something. And after a year or two, there was no doubt in my mind that this is useful. And so I actually backed up and re-aimed my career and took a lot of trainings and certifications and stuff to be able to teach this as I faded away from clinical practice. So that's it about me.
When you first got started, what was your on-ramp? Did you go for self-compassion? Were you doing mindfulness practices? How did you, what was that journey?
Yeah, it was primarily the mindfulness practices,
Mm-hmm.
Some online courses and mindfulness-based stress reduction,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps we can talk about that. And then I didn't really discover the self-compassion course or approach for about 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
That journey was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It seems you've taken extensive courses and learned to train a bunch of things.
Right. But I think as soon as you say that, I need to point out that I struggle with this stuff daily. This is an ongoing process. And what I can tell you and the listeners is I spent most of my life, I realize now, not being particularly mindful nor self-compassionate. And I can see the consequences of that. I can see how I wasn't there for people, how I could be cranky or fussy or cynical and think I deserved to be that way because I was put upon and, or just not being present for family and the people. And so I'm highly motivated to help people avoid that fate. It's much better to come to these practices in the early arc of your life rather than discovering that, I should have been doing this for a while.
Ooh, all these years. Yikes. Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that too. Yeah.
What do you think is most essential for folks to know or experience when they're just getting started in self-compassion and mindfulness?
And mindfulness. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we run into this all the time. And the number one thing is expectations, right? I mean, we've got these cultural expectations that sitting down and meditating is going to automatically make you, Zen or whatever. And the pictures, all the pictures of people sitting in like the perfect posture with the perfect outfit and the fashion industry's self-esteem destroying idea of the perfect body, it just creates these expectations that meditation mindfulness is something you do to feel better. And what I try to explain to people is, yeah, that can happen, and savor it when it does. But it's about seeing how you make yourself worse, and so it does take a little bit of courage, and it's kind of a rocky road, because you're asking yourself to get quiet and see what bubbles up away from the busyness, away from the stimulation. And often what bubbles up is difficult stuff. So it's really about learning how to work with that.
Yeah, I was just talking to some beginner meditators recently, and we were talking about that sort of wish that you would sit down and it would make you feel better, right? And sort of trying to push away unpleasant emotions or thoughts or that sort of thing. But as you're saying that, and you could certainly do a guided practice that you would feel better at the end of. Like we're talking about also the difference between guided practices and practicing kind of on your own independently. And yeah, there's some guided practices that are designed to improve a savoring practice or something that might make you feel really nice. But if we're just talking about kind of open meditation or something, then yeah, boy, all kinds of stuff is going to come up. But that's the practice, is learning to be with it in some way and be a good companion to yourself. That's why I think the self-compassion is so useful too.
You're highlighting a really good point. I think in the mindfulness world, we don't do a very good job of distinguishing between something we're doing as part of the relaxation response versus something we're doing that we're going to call mindfulness.
Right.
Like for instance, we often will start a meditation by taking a few deep breaths and invite people to release tension, which makes a lot of sense because it kind of gets you ready for the meditation. But we should probably say, warning, what we're doing is we're just triggering parts of your parasympathetic nervous system here to make you feel a little bit better. And when that does make you feel better, that's actually not the point of the practice, but enjoy that.
Right.
And also it raises the issue that if people go into something wanting to feel better, what happens? Our limbic system jumps up and says, alert, danger, my owner doesn't like this. So we automatically narrow down. I think it's even called a paradoxical response to relaxation response. I guess it's about 20% of people, when you have them do progressive muscle relaxation or something, they actually get more wired because they're really wanting something to happen.
Right. Yeah.
So the media representations are quite misleading. They imply perfection, good looks, fitness, clothes.
Yeah.
Whereas the direction we want to be able to go in is one of vulnerability and becoming okay with being compassionate messes, as they say in mindful self-compassion.
Well, yeah, or just maybe even, just really defining what's going on. Like the basic meditation, we really should be pointing out. Well, for instance, one type, meditation is like sports, but one type is the focused awareness. And that's what most people think of. Okay, I'm going to follow my breath. And then when I'm going to notice thinking, I'm going to let go of thinking. And that's a wonderful practice because, I often ask people, how many times in your life you've been told to pay attention, but the person that asked you to pay attention, did they follow up with instructions on how to pay attention? And that move of noticing your thinking and gathering your awareness, your awareness is huge. It's all over the place, but you're gathering it down to the breath. That's paying attention. And you can feel that happening with the practice. Again, not necessarily feel better, but just to develop this skill that's so useful when you want to be there for the people you love and the things you love to do. And then the other piece of that focused awareness practice is noticing your thinking. Usually we're trapped inside our thoughts. They're yanking us around, but we're actually building that skill of noticing we're thinking and releasing them. So it's two amazing skills that are occurring, but we don't really spell that out to folks. We imply that, do this for 5 minutes and you'll feel better. But what you're actually doing is practicing focusing. It's one of the first things that shows up in the research. And you're practicing unhooking from your thoughts so you can see them. And then we don't do a good job of pointing out that there's this other type of meditation that you might call investigative, okay, where rather than going back to breath with everything that pulls you away, you notice, hey, I'm having these recurrent thoughts here. What's going on here? Why don't we pause and investigate this, for instance, with the rain practice, and then look for the vulnerabilities, the fears that are underneath that, and then attend to that with self-compassion. So people don't realize that they have some real flexibility here, and just wanting to feel better limits your ability to appreciate what's available to you in that space.
Could you just briefly say what the RAIN practice is for people?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. The probably the best resource for that would be Tara Brock's website. She's done a lot of that. And RAIN is an acronym that offers a way to work with difficult emotions, or really all emotions. And the R is to simply recognize it. How often, like for me, most of my life, I thought hunger was anger or anger was hunger. I'd get them all mixed up, so it's just taking the time to recognize that there's an emotion here, and pausing and validating that. Then the A is to allow. We have to allow it to be there, to try to give up the resistance and the fighting that feeds the emotion, so we can just begin to really work with it. Then the I is investigation, which is not an intellectual thing. It's not like, oh, my mom did this to me, when I was a child, and that's why I feel this way. It's really just seeing how it shows up in the body. It took me about 4 years to realize that when someone said, well, how did that feel in your body? My first response was, who cares? I know what my body's feeling. But to really realize that there's this incredible treasure store of knowledge and wisdom in our body, if we can just drop out of the thinking mind. So the investigation really, like, oh man, is this emotion like bands across my chest? Is it tightness? And as you notice that, you can soften those. And then the N is, the N can mean things like non-identification, but I like nurturing, which is basically, wow, there's a difficult emotion here. Can I be kind to myself? Can I just practice, being nice?
Do you think the I would be where we would figure out whether it was hungry or angry?
Yeah. It actually, it's all part of the same thing. You're just really pausing to notice what's going on. But often in the allowing part, when you actually begin to see what's happening, you see usually there's a primary emotion, then often there's a secondary emotion. I'm really depressed right now. Oh, I really hate this feeling. And suddenly you can tease these things apart and begin to recognize them. And then it can get pretty elaborate too, because the investigation can also include questions, not to be answered intellectually, but is there a negative belief here that's driving this, emotion, that I'm not worthy, or I'm not lovable, or I can't handle this? And if so, what's it like to live without that belief? And simply being able to hold a difficult emotion, even for just a few seconds, it can begin to soften. And over time, it softens more and more, and you have greater skill with it.
But as you were describing them, and you got to the A, I was like, oh, I think we just lost a lot of people.
Right.
With the allow, because I think a lot of times we sort of have this experience of like, I don't want to feel this, it feels bad. Or maybe like, if I let myself feel this, I'm going to act out in a way that's unhelpful or something. So like conflating, allowing yourself to feel something with misbehaving in some way or being hurtful to someone else. I don't know. So slowing down and seeing the value and allowing the feeling seems really important.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. But I guess if we called mindfulness like turning towards suffering, people wouldn't do it at all. so maybe we need those advertisements. But yeah, this for me, this was the amazing thing about adding self-compassion after 4 years of mindfulness, because I was starting to see these habits of mind, this deep sense of unworthiness, this, fear of looking bad, the people pleasing. I was beginning to see that as something that I think many of us experience. From our childhood, we're given these messages from our culture that whoever we are, whatever we are, we're not good enough. We need to be something else, or we need to be, different in some way. And that gets so internalized for many of us that we cut ourselves out of our own circle of kindness. And so with mindfulness, you begin to see that, oh, wow, I'm really hard on myself. But the self-compassion practices say, all right, most people probably aren't going to want to meditate. They probably aren't going to find time. They don't find immediate rewards. So let's have some practices that immediately address that emptiness in the heart. Let's give people the chance to actually put their hands over their chest and feel themselves supporting themselves. Let's give people a chance to pause and say, wow, this is really hard, to validate themselves and to say, what do I need here? Well, I want someone to tell me that I'm okay. And, I'll be with you. So the self-compassion practice is really kind of address that functional problem that mindfulness eventually gets to, but just more directly. So
one point of confusion I've come across among even experienced meditators is I hear them say, well, I want to be happy. I'm not supposed to want to be happy.
Yeah.
Which is also the wrong take-home message.
Yeah, even now, I desperately want to feel better when I sit down to meditate. I want this to work. But I think for me, the realization that happiness often entails awareness. Okay. When you think back to moments when you were really happy, you were there. You were enjoying the companionship. You were savoring that great meal. You were actually noticing that you're on vacation. And when the thinking mind creeps in with the worries and fears and, all the other stuff it does, that is kind of a way of stealing our happiness. So, rather than looking for happiness, it's more about training yourself to just be available to these moments when they show up, rather than automatically drifting off into rumination and all the other things our minds tend to do. I know that's a huge subject, but that's one way I have it looking at it. And so meditation trains you to do that, trains you to notice when you're thinking. It trains you to notice how you're bringing your attention to something. It trains you to notice what it feels like. It trains you to notice what happiness feels like in your body. And that's the other thing. We spend so much time talking about working with difficult emotions, and rightfully so. But I really try to encourage people to remember to use all these practices to notice what it's like when you're neutral or when you're feeling happy. So you can remember that this is what this feels like, not to cling to it, but to be able to recognize it and savor it.
It's very common for people to sort of, especially if you're new to meditation, mindfulness, self-compassion, any of these sorts of practices, and you want it to be working for you or helping, or like you said, like making you happy, that people sort of get up off the cushion or wherever they're practicing and then kind of start evaluating it immediately. Like, do I feel better? Do I feel different? Am I happier? Did that work? Did that help? And I don't know, but my experience is like, I never feel better. Like the moment I stand up from meditating or something, it has improved my life kind of writ large, but there's never like a substantial before and after effect of meditation where I get up and I'm instantly like, yeah, I feel so much better, So I think that impulse to like immediately evaluate the moment you stop is and ends up not sort of helpful, unless it's, again, as we were saying earlier, like a guided relaxation practice. Like if I do a progressive muscle relaxation, then I do feel relaxed afterwards. But if we're talking about just kind of open kind of awareness meditation practice, it's just like the benefits are very like ineffable on some level. I don't know. Like I can tell when I'm not doing it that I don't feel as grounded or something, but yeah.
Yeah, that's well put. And I know exactly what you're talking about. For the first few years, I would talk myself into thinking that, I meditated this morning. Oh, things are so much easier today. And that was a delusion. And of course, that's the way we all are, right? We're type A Westerners. If we're going to do something, we want results. We want to see it. And you use the perfect word. It's so subtle, the changes. And it's like going to the gym and you do one bicep curl and then am I stronger? Is my muscle bigger?
Do you have a six pack yet?
Yeah. Right. So yeah, speaking of the fashion industry's effect on us, but the idea again with the meditation is just to recognize that act of noticing your thinking and coming back to the focus is going to have an effect. It won't show up the way you want it to. It won't show up as fast as you want it to. We tend not to talk about results, but I often share the story of, I started doing this and after 2 to 3 months, kind of wondering what's going on. And then, I got into a difficult conversation with a loved one, as we tend to do with our loved ones. And I suddenly noticed, wait a minute, I'm feeling this warmth and this heat. I'm really angry here. and I'm about to do something unwise. And it was just a shock. For the first time in my life, suddenly I was out of autopilot. And for that was one of the moments that told me, okay, this is worth sticking with. Now, the ironic thing is I went ahead and said that thing that made my home life miserable for 2 days, I think, as Dan Harris says, which was fascinating to watch that. But it just created a sense. And the other thing that I think early on that it's so subtle, we can't run a controlled experiment on ourselves. Right. We can't, you get it. You can't have one of us be meditating and one of yourselves not meditating. But the idea of cognitive reframing, they talk about that a lot, particularly in the first, couple of months to actually, by practicing letting go of thoughts, you begin to notice them. And then you can really notice, wow, this thought is going to take me nowhere fast. Or, so again, it's more this idea that you're, again, like going to the gym, you're building skills that are useful out in life, even if at first you can't really detect them.
Yeah.
Just to put a footnote and report my personal experience, doing the mindful self-compassion circles of practice with Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, I frequently end up feeling better. The sense of community, the sense of connection, and it sort of leads me to an awareness that is much more functional and expansive and so on. So
right. Yeah, I guess
where I am at this point in my journey.
Yeah. And thank you for mentioning that, because I certainly don't want people ending this podcast thinking that, oh my gosh, I'm just going to feel beat up every time I meditate. No, there's, and that's the wonderful thing about the self-compassion practices, right? The meditation can often be awareness, and you can definitely get into, some ease and some soothing and that kind of stuff. But the self-compassion practices are readily accessible. They're like, okay, we're settling down, we're following our breath, but now look at this sadness you have, and let's really attend to this. And that's very powerful. So that's why I really like teaching mindful self-compassion, because you get the awareness component, but you have this immediate availability of these compassion practices that do end up soothing you.
Yeah, those self-compassion practices are essentially guided practices. So they're inducing a specific kind of state, right, while you're doing them. Plus, if you're practicing in a group, then you get the benefit of community and all of that as well.
Yeah. Let me pause on that. The self-compassion practices are guided, and they often have that kind of positive result. But in the self-compassion world, we have this thing called Backdraft, which isn't a thing just for the self-compassion world, but it's the idea that when we really begin to attend to ourselves with kindness, it's like we have these frozen emotions in our hearts from childhood or life that we've just kind of sealed away and closed off. And when we begin to warm up our heart with this kind of kindness, and by the way, if someone told me 10 years ago I was going to be saying phrases like this, warming up the heart, I'd be like, no way. But the point is, once we begin to attend to ourselves with kindness, those areas begin to melt. And so these difficult emotions can arise. And sometimes that's a real issue. And we always talk about, backing off from a practice, or going very slowly, or just, listening to your inner guide to just do it a little bit by bit. So I guess I just want to make the point that the self-compassion practices can be challenging as well.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Ultimately, the research across the board for mindfulness and self-compassion suggests that it's useful.
Paul Gilbert likens Backdraft to opening a book at the page where you left it. If the last page was not receiving kindness and not being attended to in a healthy way, then that's where I am. It can be confusing for people.
Yeah. No, that's exactly. And that's why, when we do self-compassion trainings, it's really all about safety, because you never quite know what's going to show up. But ultimately what we're trying to do is find those places and offer ourselves compassion for those times in our life where we were hurting, but we didn't receive it,
Yeah. So my daily meditation practice is more of an open awareness kind of practice. And what I've noticed with the self-compassion is that it started to become more fluidly integrated, so that when there's a moment of difficulty, or my mind is like really, really busy, or if I've sat down in a painful state or something like that, that there's just a more fluid ability to kind of just be like, oh, kindness, like hand on the heart, or just like a moment, built into that process of focusing the mind, focusing on the breath, what have you, noticing the mind wandering, coming back, but in that process, having the ability to also just kind of almost PRN, like as needed, little moments of compassion when those difficulties arise, whether it's a difficulty with the practice or just something that my mind is wandering off to that's hard.
Spontaneously.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, you can, I was talking about the different types of meditation. This is just kind of real generalized, but yeah, you have the focused awareness at one end, back to the focus. You have the more investigative one, which is you may still come back and forth to the focus, but you attend to whatever is arising, physical pain, emotional pain. Then the open awareness is where you're just kind of opening up to all the things, and then there's also what they might call natural or effortless awareness, that sense that, you really are aware of yourself and the space around you. And I don't mean to present this as a hierarchy. And then people go, oh, I want that one, because for me, the focused awareness and investigating what's come up is just so valuable. But when I think people move towards those open awareness practices, we begin to realize, this compassion, this equanimity, this kindness, it's here. It's already right here. So when that difficulty pops up, you're just naturally offering that to yourself from in this greater space of awareness. And I hope I'm not creating expectations or goal-directed meditative behavior in anyone. It's all good.
Well, it's sort of a koan, I think. It's like the pathless path, the goalless goal, like in Buddhism, that sort of idea that like we have to have a reason to sit down, even if we're not like rigid about, some specific outcome at the same time. Like all of our behaviors have some motive, but we also don't want to bring such a rigid expectation to it that we sort of squash it, or yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I point out that, well, two things. The great irony is that our discursive thinking mind tells us that something's wrong, so we better try meditation. So when we sit down and meditate, our discursive mind is the first thing to jump in and say, this isn't working. Let's move on to Peruvian panpipes or something.
There are numerous apparent paradoxes on this path, aren't there?
Yeah.
And the way to work through them is to practice and reflect and feel.
Yeah. And the other thing that strikes me, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but there's this anthropologic theory I think it's called the primary well-being, something like that. But it has to do with the fact that hunter-gatherers, the situations in which our minds developed, probably spent 2.5 days actually working on survival-based activities. And the rest of the time
per week.
2.5 days per week. So the rest of the time, obviously I'm not really implying that their life was easy or anything like that, but there wasn't this nonstop stimulus and demands and obligations and busyness. And so if you look at mindfulness not as a way to feel better, but as a way to give yourself your natural mind state for 10 minutes, just to eliminate the busyness and stimulus, then a lot of the subroutines in your mind tend to quiet down a little bit, and things will pop up that are important that you would never notice because there was no time to experience it. That's one of my favorite things. One of my challenging things is to, meditating at the end of the day, you actually have a chance to explore all those moments that were difficult or frustrating or irritating. And as you explore them, you can learn a lot more about yourself. And, that's, again, this idea that mindfulness isn't necessarily about feeling better. It's just giving yourself this time to learn these really important things.
You see why the book 4-Hour Workweek is popular.
Yeah.
The 2.5-day work week.
Right. Yeah, just being in that natural state of presence with yourself, as you're saying, is a really nice way to just kind of remember who you are on some level. Like I was thinking recently about what does it mean to follow your gut, or follow your intuition, or even know what you think and feel or want, or be genuine in life. And it's hard to know all of those things if you're so caught up being reactive to life circumstances and other people's demands all the time. It seems like there's something about meditation that allows you to just be you, just like be in your own consciousness for a few minutes. That's like grounding and helps all that stuff.
Right. Yeah. And again, it builds that skill. The famous quote, there's a space between stimulus and response. And in that space is our freedom to choose our response. And that choice is our growth and our freedom. And, all day long, we're just stimulus response, just reacting nonstop. But if we spend that 5 minutes or 10 minutes in meditation, we get a chance to see what it's like to actually see a thought and choose to follow it. So out in the real world, maybe we can give ourselves a little bit of space. So as you put it, you are more of who you are going into the next present moment. It's not about the present moment. Yeah, that's nice to enjoy washing the dishes and, seeing the trees and everything. But you want to gather yourself so that you're being who you want to be into the next moment as it approaches, rather than your reactive self.
Yeah.
So you are different in your life and in your actions and how you relate in real time.
Yeah. I mean, it gets to the fact that when we are busy and stressed, that fight or flight mind is just taking over, and it is just by definition narrowed down. It can't be all of who we are. And most of us are pretty skillful at reacting skillfully, but it's so much better when you suddenly realize you have some options. That's another, definition of mindfulness, giving yourself options when you think there are none. We have these habits of mind that are so ingrained, we can't even see them. And so it feels like fate. I have to be this way. And you get to see that. And that also, I just really quick, just some gratitude and appreciation for what you guys are doing just in the mental health world. It took me far too long in my life to realize that some of those patterns are so ingrained you can't see them even in meditation. You need to take them out of your head, put them in the lap of a professional like you guys, and have you kind of, this doesn't make too much sense, and then put it back in. And so again, much gratitude for what you all are doing.
Well, I have two directions we could go. One is, you mentioned a few minutes ago about 10 years ago, you would never have said something like feeling warm in your heart or something. So I'm curious about what kind of socialization or life experiences led to that, do you think? To that feeling of never, I wouldn't do that. And then obviously you've been working and transforming since then. So that's one question. The other is more around healthcare and just, where these practices may be helpful.
Yeah, well, I think maybe we'll have time for both of them. I think the first one is really important because, for me, I didn't realize that I was lacking in self-compassion. I was very successful, did all the right, went on medical missions, wrote textbooks, and, worked at the free clinic, did all the right things. And that was because, my values are to help people, but also there was a component of that, like the motivations were marbled, that was trying to fill this hole that I had to accomplish these things. I was driven to do these things. And when a part of you is driven to do something, you can get way out of balance with your work life, your family balance. You can hold people to standards that you can't even meet in yourself. So you can be really judgmental and critical, and you aren't aware of your inner life in a way that means you aren't aware of other people's inner lives. So you can't see when they're struggling or suffering because you're like, got to get this done. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is figure out how to make self-compassion powerful to the many people we see in our world that don't know they need it. And they're acting in this driven, and part of that is perfectionism, and part of that is refusing to be wrong. I have to be right because otherwise, I have to face the fact that I'm not worthy. So yeah, it's just, just part of it is just not even realizing that compassion was an issue until I got quiet and really attended to these things and saw, for instance, kind of moving into healthcare a bit, probably everyone listening to this has had the experience of feeling brushed off by a physician. Okay. And
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. And part of that is the system and not enough time. But part of it is, if you're working from this place where you need to perform to be a people pleaser, to get your approval from your patients, simple things like a patient asking me a question. These little old ladies would come in, they'd need injections every month to keep them seeing. And they'd ask me, why am I getting this every visit? And I would get mad. I mean, I wouldn't show it, I don't think, but I certainly wasn't behaving the way I would want to behave, and I felt in that framework that I deserve to be mad. I'm working hard, I'm communicating, I'm doing all this stuff, and they're asking me the same question. But then when I did the mindfulness piece and saw that anger building up, and I paid attention to that, and I saw underneath that anger was this vulnerability. Like, I can't face the fact that I might be a bad communicator and bad doctor, such that I realized that when that little old lady was asking, why am I getting this shot again? She wasn't asking me that. She was saying, Dr. Walker, you're a bad communicator and you probably don't care about me. And it's ridiculous that I would think that. But just so I see that in so many people. I just want to be able to offer these practices. So that would be one piece of it.
Yeah, especially I think anyone in a sort of helping profession is often drawn to that profession for a variety of reasons, and probably really wants to help and serve other people, but also, as you're saying, maybe has a kind of a driven part of that that makes it hard to face when you just can't, when something's beyond your capacity or your expertise, or it's harder to accept feedback or something. But also it's harder to maybe reckon with the fact that maybe you're not always the sort of picture of compassion. Maybe you do have anger. Maybe you do get impatient. Maybe those things need to be worked on.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But also just realizing that a lot of that anger or frustration is because you can't be your own best friend.
Right.
You can't offer yourself the support that no one else and no system is going to offer you. And it just, for me, that was transformative, because suddenly those little old ladies, it was wonderful. Like, oh, I'm going to decrease suffering. I'm going to answer her question again, but it's going to make her feel good. And then we can talk about the grandkids. And it just made patient care the wonderful thing it was when I was much younger.
Nice. I'm wondering if it might be a good time for us to answer one of the questions you asked us.
Absolutely. I'll drop the first one in, which was, you people who routinely and voluntarily interface with some of the most difficult things, that people have experienced, the traumas and the sadness, the depression. If there was one thing you could change about either how the human mind works or how society works, maybe two or three things. But if there's one thing that would just change a lot of the suffering you see, or maybe put it more bluntly, to put you out of a job.
That'd be good.
What do you think that would be?
If we look at maybe the human mind and human culture, I think maybe together, because I think that our culture is a reflection of our sort of default mode in our minds, as a collective. So I think the two are sort of connected. And I would, if I could change one thing, I think it would be helping humans not to just live from a mode of survival. I would change the speed of the reflex of fight or flight. That's what I would change. Or at least give us more control over the speed of that. Because I suppose if we were stepping into traffic, we need it to move really quickly. But maybe we'd have more opportunities to be more skillful about when we might do that so that we could have more choice about how we respond, and to not always be living from that mode of just basic survival. And that would allow us to, for instance, be more compassionate and empathic with other people, which would change the world profoundly.
I wrote that down. If we could get us to potentiometer for our fight or flight. but going back to what we're talking about, that's really what mindfulness is hoping to happen, to slow down. But still, I really like, and and the idea of just, if we would just remember that we're all in this together.
Right. I was trying to think of something that would have that impact at a cultural level. Inside the body or brain.
I think for me, if I could make the entire human civilization trauma sensitive, that I'm thinking about redesigning society as well as healthcare and education and war.
Right. Yeah, there is that.
Right.
Yeah.
If there was something I could remove from the planet, right? If that's, in the scope of this question, it would certainly be trauma.
Yeah.
Man's inhumanity to man, that whole thing.
Well, that's good. Okay, let's work on that.
Yeah, let's try to tackle that one, could we?
What about you? You must have heard some really good answers.
You must have an answer to this question.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. My favorite was a psychiatrist, and as you guys probably know, psychiatrists can be kind of different in how they view things. Maybe you've had a sense of that. But he said we need a better rail system.
I mean, there's no wrong answer, I guess.
but
more transportation, please.
Connectivity, interconnectedness. But the one thing that seems to come up pretty consistently is if people could just learn to be nice to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whatever. You know, one of my co-students at a program was a really interesting guy. He was a bond trader. And at a relatively young age, he decided this isn't working. I want to give back. You know, I just want to, so he went into the elementary schools and started teaching mindfulness. And he says it was so sad to see like the first and second graders just be open and curious and having a great time. And then third and fourth graders starting to make sure they had the right outfit and the lunchbox with the TV characters. And we're looking, you know, just this transition from, as you said, absorbing the culture's thoughts as our own.
Yeah.
You know, and through that, seeing how everyone else is awesome and I'm not. That's just that sad message that just makes it so hard for so many of us. And as you said, it also separates us, right? Because if we're starting to feel like I've got to figure this out on my own and I'm in charge of my life and personal responsibility, I don't have to worry about anyone else, that takes away from that sense of interconnection. But
yeah, if I had another answer, it might be something around like hyper-individualism and like hypervigilance and of self-observation that we tend to have in the West in particular. I feel like there's this really intense focus on the self, you know, and the self is this like solid, rigid thing, and it has to be cultivated and conform and be pleasing to others or lovable or, you know, all the ways in which we're good or bad or, you know, always being assessed and judged. And I just feel like this intense focus on the sort of hyper individualized self is a source of great pain and suffering as well. Yeah,
for ourselves and spreads out into the culture. I mean, right. I don't want to repeat something that's covered a lot on podcasts, but the famous Dalai Lama story of being asked about self-hatred.
Right. Yeah.
Just
you could say it again because I don't remember the last episode. We mentioned it at some point.
Yeah. And the story is, I guess, he was giving a talk and someone asked, "What about all these people that really don't like themselves, that are hard on themselves? This epidemic of self-hatred." And it took 15 minutes for his translator to explain what that meant, because that was something that didn't compute. He had no idea of what that was, and he looked up and said, "Well, that's wrong."
Right.
Yeah. And he had to come to the West to be asked that question. So yeah.
I have taken and taught a class on the history of psychology and this idea of the self being something that is not universal or forever. Like at some point, the culture started to create this kind of chicken and the egg feedback loop where people started to pay attention to it. And then other people started to notice people paying attention to it. And then they started paying attention to it. And it became thingified as a thing, but that's not how all cultures live or how all humans were throughout all time. It's kind of mind blowing to sort of remember that or to take that in really, and then think about how we think about ourselves and how culturally determined that is, even though it's, you know, as so many culturally determined things are like totally invisible to us on a daily basis. Culture, what culture, you know, but then like you're totally living. It's like the fish saying what's water. Right.
Right.
For granted.
Yeah. And
Jon, what would your answer be to that question?
I feel like, just again, whatever gets inserted into so many of us at a young age that we're not good enough, if we could undo that, you know, like I said at the beginning, you know, so much of things that I look back and regret were fundamentally from, you know, not being able to support myself, you know, just for instance, lack of assertiveness, people pleasing, you know, introversion, you know, not being the caregiver I wanted to be because I was missing a chunk of compassion that I should have been having. So I guess that's how I'd look at it.
Huge.
Yeah, that's a big one.
I'd also love to hear your thoughts about resourcing, what it is.
Yeah, that was my second question. If that's what you're referring to, I was asking you guys what your favorite resourcing move is, and so for me, coming from a mindfulness perspective, well, traditionally, resourcing is something that's done, again, you guys know better than I, in the mental health world, to get people out of that busy, spinning, anxious, trauma-focused mind, looking at the walls, feeling your feet on the floor, feeling your hands, simply as a way to get out of a very difficult mind spin. The mindfulness piece would be to say, okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to give ourselves a break from the thinking mind. But again, this will give us a chance to regather who we are, remember what our values are, and go into that next moment better. So for instance, something like, taking a deep breath might be a way to get someone to just lower their activation, lower their level of being triggered. And it certainly works that way. But the mindfulness, taking a deep breath, would be, okay, we're going to pause and we're going to actually notice what this deep breath is going to feel like. And we're going to notice how our body rises and falls. And we're not going to have any expectations for any result, but that's what we're going to do, and then through that, that added awareness piece, you get to bring in a little bit more. And then you can expand the resourcing, for instance, tossing in a little self-compassion break at the end if you need it. Or in Indiana, a lot of it is, your higher power, your relationship with traditional devotional practice. Just rather than reacting, giving yourself that little bit of space to reconnect with yourself. So does that answer your question, Alex?
It does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I would say my answer to your question, it would also so you were wondering what our most common resourcing technique might be that we offer to people. And I would say it's basically what you just described, more or less, and in terms that would be, sort of meaningful and appropriate to the individual I'm talking to, right? And what their value system is, what their belief system is, how open they are to mindfulness or not, that kind of stuff. But some way of okay, let's just take a moment to slow down, catch our breath, ground ourselves, take some perspective. I talk a lot about how people talk to themselves, what the tone of voice is that people talk to themselves in. Are you kind of berating yourself or being harsh with yourself, or let's just slow things down, right? And just let's use a friendly tone of voice when we talk to ourselves in our head, so that kind of thing I feel is helpful and often invisible to people until you point it out. So that's very helpful. But yeah, some kind of basic grounding and developing that basic reflex of kindness when we're struggling, having a hard time here. Let's slow down, give ourselves some gentleness and kindness, and some perspective taking. Let's get the bigger view here, allow some wisdom to emerge,
Yeah, all the while your phone's going off and the kids are hollering and you got it stuck in traffic. But you're right. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. One of the simplest things I do is when I talk about resourcing or anything is, and maybe your listeners can do this right now, is just check into your body. As you hear me speaking, notice that you can understand my words, but ask your neck and shoulders, are they where they want to be? How's your belly? Can you soften it a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
And just, or asking your chest how it wants to breathe. I mean, mine wants to be like this. And then again, seeing if there's tightness in the belly, just letting that release. And for me, that was very valuable in my career because I realized I was burning between 5 to 30% more energy than I needed to. Even in a relatively serene setting like this, there's always that little bit of edge, that little bit of fight or flight that's keeping us from really being fully there. Yeah. So, thank you. Well, thank you for answering my question. But I guess none of it includes a better railway system, although it would be.
Maybe we could get there if we were more compassionate, and kind to ourselves and each other. We might realize that would also be helpful. Right. But from what you were just saying, it reminds me of this idea of dual attention, which is helpful in couples therapy, but also in people having any kind of interpersonal interaction or as a clinician working with a client or patient, of sort of learning to be aware of your body at the same time that you're aware of the other person's experience, or rather, I guess you're flipping very quickly between the two, right? So that you can stay connected to your body, stay connected to your breath, as you're saying, do that kind of little body scan, right? Soften the shoulders. How do I want to sit? What feels good? But then also be with somebody else at the same time. So giving them your attention and kind of going back and forth in a very fluid way. So you don't lose yourself in the encounter.
Yeah. I almost call that mindful multitasking. We know that regular multitasking, strips us away and we lose IQ and all that kind of stuff. But our awareness is vast, and we can actually hold the communication, that other person in our bodies, in this vast awareness, as long as we're not trying to make something happen or do something. So that's, and what did you call that? Dual awareness?
Dual awareness or dual attention.
Dual attention. Thanks. Yeah.
Even just recording these podcast episodes, I think somehow Zoom has helped cultivate that a little bit, because there's just a little more distance between the person you're talking to in some way. So it feels a little easier for me to stay connected to my body and be like totally present in a conversation. I don't know. It's very
beautiful. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm just writing down notes.
Thank you very much for speaking with us, Jon. This is a real pleasure. And how can people learn more about your work or study with you? Where should they go?
Well, I have a website called Modestly Mindful, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and that's about it. I'm not trying to build an empire or anything like that. I just do this, as it comes up, often as a volunteer. I guess that would be the other thing. If people are listening and they have an organization that could use a little mindfulness and self-compassion, particularly if it's a nonprofit or in healthcare, feel free to get in touch with me through the website. And, I often do introductory sessions, just as a volunteer, just really to give people a chance to think about these things in a different way.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks so much, Jon. This has been great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
great
thank you guys
today.
very much.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.